Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Warren Cann. I'm the CEO of the Parenting Research Centre and a psychologist that's had an interest in parenting now for nearly 30 years, and I'm very pleased to be able to spend some time with you here over cyberspace. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar. I also just want to let you know that I have Kim Campbell with me as well, who's going to be helping out with helping me deliver this webinar and keeping an eye on the chat room, which I'll explain in a moment. I would just say at this point, in addition to the welcome, that I hope you can be a little patient with me. This is a new technology for me. I'm still finding my way around a little bit, so I asked you ahead of time to forgive any bumbling that might go on as I push the wrong buttons and say the wrong thing. Before we start talking about what we're going to cover, I just wanted to take you through a couple of housekeeping matters in relation to the webinar. The first thing to let you know is that the webinar is actually being recorded. This will create a permanent product that you'll be able to access after the webinar, after we process it, and you're also more than welcome to share it with your colleagues. The second thing is that you'll notice if you look at your screen, there's a chat facility. And anytime that you wish, you can write a message in that chat area. Kim is monitoring those messages, and even though we can't provide high-level technical support, there may be some things we can help you with if you are struggling with the technology. So let us know, and Kim will see what she can do. Otherwise, she'll be keeping an eye on that chat. You're welcome to ask questions at any point. You're welcome to chat with each other. You're welcome to heckle the speaker. You can do whatever you like there in that chat room. You're more than welcome to make comments. And I'll keep half an eye on that as we go through the webinar and respond to some things as we go if I can. Otherwise, Kim will be keeping an eye on those questions, and we'll try and keep some time at the end to address questions and comments. Also, I just wanted to ask that you take a little bit of time to fill out our feedback form at the end of the webinar. There'll be a link that'll come up on your screen, and if you could take a moment to respond, it should only take a few minutes, only a few questions. But yeah, we are very keen to learn about how the webinar came across and what you enjoyed about it, what you think we could do differently or better. That will help us with our own learning. Just finally, with the technology, you may be on different types of technology. This particular platform is particularly good on computers. It's a little weaker on mobile devices. So if you are on a mobile device like an iPad or an iPhone, we apologise ahead of time. You might not get access to all of the different functionality in the screen, but you should still be able to hear us and still be able to see what's happening. So, but yeah, you just might find some other things a bit trickier. I just wanted to alert you to that. Also, I just wanted to say, because I'm concerned there might have been a little bit of confusion about this. This webinar is a version of a face-to-face masterclass that I delivered in Perth some time ago. We agreed up front that given that not everybody can come to face-to-face seminars in the city, that we would provide a webinar as a kind of a way of at least getting access to some of the content. So if you were at the workshop or the masterclass that I ran recently in Perth, then this material is going to be essentially the same material. So that means you might have something better to do. You're more than welcome to stay. There's often new bits and pieces. I can never give the same talk exactly the same way every time. So you're more than welcome to stay, but I do want to let you know that we are covering the same content that we covered in the workshop, because we wanted to make sure that everybody had access to it in one way or another. So I apologise if that's caused any confusion, but just to reiterate, it is the same, essentially some of the same content that we delivered at the masterclass. And before we talk about what we covered in the webinar, I just wanted to acknowledge that even though we are meeting here in cyberspace, some weird cyber cloud, we actually are all on the ground somewhere, and with every bit of ground, that ground is connected to land, and in Australia that land has a traditional owner, and I want to begin by acknowledging those traditional owners and paying my respects to elders past and present, to whoever and wherever you are joining us from. I also wanted to acknowledge that the first Australians have been successfully raising children for many thousands of years, and obviously bring a huge body of knowledge to the art of raising human beings, and we stand to benefit from that if only we can listen and pay attention. This webinar is brought to you by the Government of Western Australia, by the Department of Communities, and I just want to say how fantastic it has been to work with Craig from the Centre of Parenting Excellence and his team. It's been a real delight. As I said, this is part of a series of programs that we're doing for the Centre, and it's being made possible by the West Australian Government and by the Department. When you go to a workshop, you can have a look around the room and see who's there. So we thought we might give you that opportunity to have a bit of a look around the room and understand who's participating. Now, this is information that comes from your registration forms, and as always, there's a little bit of drop-off between registration and attendance, but at registration, this is what we learned about you, that about a third of you were practitioners, about a third of you are involved in organisational leadership. We only managed to tempt a few policymakers to our webinar, and then there's about a third who were in a different category, not in any category that we had there, and those people who are doing project work and different program work. So we wanted to welcome everybody and just give you a sense of who's in the room. One of the things that I hope is that the kind of content that I'm sharing with you today might be the kind of content that you can share with policymakers, that you can use to help to justify and to make the argument for why we need to be doing good and effective parenting support. We also asked you to let us know what sector you were from, and as you can see here, about over half of you are from the community sector. We have some people from health and education, which is fantastic, and then 14% from others, including mental health and some other sectors as well. So we're quite a diverse group, and that's also terrific because parenting and parenting support is relevant to all of those sectors. Okay, so what are we going to be covering today? First of all, I wanted to touch on what parenting actually is, to define parenting, because I want us to be clear on what we are actually talking about, or at least our definition of parenting. Then I thought we might touch on some of the universal qualities of effective parenting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time unpacking what sort of good parenting is. This is not about how to go about parenting. This workshop is more about understanding what the science says about the impacts of parenting, and then relating that to how we think about parenting support. So given what the science says about parenting, what does that mean when we're thinking about how best to support parents? So I want to spend most of my time in the workshop talking about how we understand the effects of parenting on children, and also then how that leads into understanding how and what we should do in terms of providing support. I also will touch on some developments, some innovations in parenting support, and then, as I said earlier, hopefully leave some time at the end for questions. Okay, if that is all right with everybody, we'll get stuck into our content, and we're going to do that by beginning with getting our getting our concept straight and understanding what we're talking about here. How do we define parenting? And the perspective that we're bringing to this is that we think of parenting as the task of raising children. Parenting is about the activity, the role, or the function of raising children, and that's different from being a parent. A parent could be just a biological relation. A parent could actually be doing the parenting, or it could be that there are key adults in a child's life who are doing the parenting, who are filling the parenting role. And the comments I'll be making today relate to this, the task or action of, or activity of raising children, and I just wanted to acknowledge up front that that task or activity and that responsibility may sit with a whole range of different people, depending on culture, situation, and context, and so on. But what we want to focus on is parenting. And whilst I don't want to do a really deep dive into what constitutes effective parenting, there were just a couple of things I wanted to mention. The first is that what the research I think really does tell us is that it's what parents do that matters, not who they are. And you can often see quite a significant, almost obsession with sort of types of parents and the implications of that. Young parents, single parents, same-sex parents, old parents, so on. There's often quite a focus on the sociology of families and what that means for families and what it means for raising children. But what the research says about the impact of parenting itself is that it's not who you are, it's what you do that matters. And what we've found, or what science tells us, is that there's a significant consistency in that, and that in the end, what matters is what you do, not who you are. It's quite possible to be able to be an effective parent no matter what kind of background, what kind of family structure you have, what your gender is. Effective parenting is possible. So I'm going to be not focusing too much on the structure of families, but more on the impacts of parenting itself and what parenting actually means. And then I think that what we possibly could at least say is that there are a number of potentially universally important parenting qualities, and that these qualities traverse culture, traverse race, and probably traverse time. I thought I might just touch on quickly what some aspects of effective parenting are. The first is sensitivity. So parents who are coping well and where their children are doing well illustrate or demonstrate sensitivity. That is, they're able to pay attention, they're able to tune in, they're able to read their children's needs effectively, and they're able to be responsive to those needs. So they're able to adjust the way they respond, how they act, based on a reasonably accurate understanding of what their child is doing. So sensitivity and responsiveness are important. An important part of responsiveness is the ability to be contingent. That is, to be able to respond in a balanced, constructive way to what children are doing. To respond in a way, not overreact, for example, but to be able to react in a way that's contingent and appropriate in the circumstance. Another really important and universal quality of effective parenting is warmth. Affection is an essential ingredient of good parenting, and whilst affection and warmth can be delivered in lots of different ways and can look very different depending on who is illustrating or who is demonstrating the affection. Affection can look different by culture, it can look different by gender. You might even see mums and dads being affectionate in different ways. And yet what you'll find is that even though those behaviours differ in form, they look different. What you'll find is they are similar in function. They achieve the same thing. They achieve the building of relationship, the strengthening of relationship. They achieve the communication of affection and warmth. And so here again is why we want to be more interested in function than in form, because there are lots of different ways of being effective as a parent. Another key ingredient to effective parenting is flexibility. And what we mean by that is essentially it's about having a relatively full parenting toolkit. It means having a number of responses up your sleeve to, for example, your child's behaviour or the situations and contexts in which you find yourself, not being stuck into one single response. Flexibility comes from effective self-regulation. It comes from paying attention to what's happening. It comes from learning about the effects of your own behaviour on your children, what happens as you parent them, learning from your mistakes and learning from your successes, replicating the things that work well for you, but dropping the things that don't work well for you. And that is a crucial aspect of effective parenting, and that is this capability of being flexible. And the final thing that I just wanted to highlight in this little section is that nurturing is important too. And this it goes beyond warmth and affection. It goes to the teaching and learning aspects of parenting, that what parents are doing is promoting the growth and development of their children, creating an environment in which the children can learn, and also creating interaction opportunities to learn through their daily interactions. We'll come back to that in the future. But what parents are doing is helping children develop the skills that they're going to need to be functional, contributing adults in the society in which those parents are raising their children into. And you might notice of those things that I've highlighted there, those 5 kind of key ingredients or qualities, they're all ingredients of adult functioning. And I think that's important to point out, that I think that what we have been, perhaps maybe even my industry has been partly responsible for this, but I think in the past what we've tended to do is kind of emphasize the speciality of the skills of raising children, and yet often raising children is about, effective relationships, and effective relationships are important everywhere in life, whether that be in couple relationships and relationships with family. And some of the core underlying skills that help us be effective in our relationships, our other relationships, we draw on those every day in our parenting. I think the other thing I just wanted to point out about this is how much of this is about adult development and adult functioning. And that just points to a reality that parenting is something that, all things being equal, we are equipped to do by our experience, by growing up, by developing adult skills to be able to do these kinds of things, and then learning how to apply them in a parenting situation, in a parenting scenario. And where parents have been given adequate opportunity in their own development to develop these skills, then they come fully equipped to learn on the job and do what it takes to be an effective parent. I mean, there's lots to learn, but these skills do equip them to undertake that learning journey. Okay, so that's a really quick romp through, what we think are the key and potentially universal ingredients of effective parenting. Let's now turn to this question of the effects of parenting. And in doing that, we are essentially turning to that age-old debate or discussion, the nature-nurture debate. And the nature-nurture debate is one that has been going on for some time. I'm happy to announce, if you haven't heard already, that debate is well and truly, I think, finished. I think we're in a position to say that both nature and nurture are important in children's development and well-being. Let's have a quick look at what we mean by that. The nature debate, or at least the sophistication in our understanding of the impact of the environment, goes way back to the days of Sigmund Freud. And in his time and in his thinking, we thought of infants as essentially being blank slates, and then we craft their personality through a process of relating, that the way parents raise their children will determine the way they turn out. It's why we sometimes lay awake at night wondering what our children will say to their therapist one day. Is that basic idea comes from this kind of belief that parents essentially determine how their children turn out, and woe betide them getting things wrong, because if they get it wrong, they could do great harm or do great damage to their children. Sort of notion of blank slate that then is molded and built on by socialization and by particularly what their parents do, and in Freud's time, particularly the way he understood it, particularly what mothers do. But then as science got a better understanding of genetics, we came to understand that actually it's not that simple, that children are not born as a blank slate. In fact, they come into the world with a genetic predisposition to behave in particular ways. Every child is different at the point of birth. Every mother who's got more than one child can identify how those children are different, and they're different right from birth, sometimes even before. Mothers are noticing differences in utero in the way babies are and the way babies are behaving. And there are very significant aspects of our development that are hardwired, that come in the form of temperament, which are genetically determined predispositions to behave in certain ways. So behaviours like shyness are genetically determined. We can identify inhibition in very, very young children, very, very early on, a long way before their parents have had a chance to stuff them up. We can identify children who are different, and they're different because of temperament, and they're different because of this genetic pre-wiring of their behavioural predispositions. And there's continues to be growing and strong evidence about the importance of temperament on children's development. For example, this fairly recent study looked at the role of inhibition in children's willingness to accept new foods, and what they found was that children who were more inhibited that is find it difficult to deal with new things, approach new people. Guess what? They also find it difficult to approach new foods and are less willing to accept foods they're not familiar with. And so here we have temperament shaping the way young children respond to the foods that are offered to them by their parents. Also just recently, another very interesting study came out that found that about 84% of the variation in a person's appetite can be is determined by a person's genes. 84% of their variation in appetite. And also 53% of the extent to which they enjoy food is also genetically predetermined. And so we come into the world with these very strong tendencies built into our genetics, and it's very important for us to understand that parenting is not a level playing field. It's not that there are good kids and bad kids, but kids are different, and because kids are different, they'll respond differently to their environment, and those differences are very active in shaping the kind of environment that they have. So it's true to say now that the modern way of thinking about child development is an ecological model, and Bronfenbrenner was really important here in pointing out the ecological basis of development. What he and others since have demonstrated is that we need to understand child development in context. The children develop not just individually, they do bring their genetic predispositions to things, but they develop in the context of family, the context of relationship. And those families live in a context of community. Those communities live in a social context and even a time context as well. And we understand all of these things to be important. And I don't want to minimize some of the social impacts on child development because they are important. For example, there's one recently that I've become more interested in. This is a process that people have actually invented a new word for, technoference, which is a term that's being used to describe the impact of parental use of technology. I don't know whether you've noticed this, but I certainly have. The amount of time parents, for example, in cafes or when you're out, spend on their devices. Sometimes when their children are sitting right there, you'll see both parents on the devices. And I don't want to get all moralistic and start a moral outrage, but I think it is getting to the point where we have to start to wonder to what extent is parental device use beginning to impact on parent-child interactions and relationships, and ought we start to become concerned about that? And what does it mean to parent in an age where you can get immediate access to sometimes quite stimulating, engaging material? How much time is that taking away from interacting with our children, which is important for their development and for relationship building? Society is important, and social factors impact on our parenting for sure. But what we are also finding out is that this is not just a spaghetti model, that in fact the pathways to the way parenting impacts on children are actually quite complex. And we need to get a better, more nuanced understanding of those pathways. It's not just everything affects everything else. There are in fact pathways of effect. And I just wanted to say about the ecological model that sometimes is forgotten, is that a key idea in the ecological model is that the closer you get to the child, the tighter concentric circles you get, the bigger impact. So families have a significantly bigger impact on children's development than, for example, society does. And we're going to have a look at how that works. All right, this is not even contribution. They're all important, but they're uneven. Families have a much more significant impact on children's development, individual children. And society and other factors tend to impact on children by affecting the operations of family, in particular the impact on parenting. So that's what I wanted to take you a little bit through. So I hope you're still with me. Going along, I wanted to touch on 3 different pathways in which parenting impacts on children. And the first is the direct pathway. That is, what aspects of parenting impact on children directly? And what we do know about this is that there are some direct effects. And for example, one area where there's a really direct effect is in language and cognitive development. And there's now substantial research that shows that the home learning environment, the sorts of opportunities provided by families in the home, has a significant impact on children's cognitive development and their language development. In fact, just the sheer number of words that children hear in those first 3 years of life can really shape a child's vocabulary and their language use and their cognitive ability. And so the environment is important, but so is the everyday interactions that parents have with children. All those micro interactions add up to contribute to children's development. And then in this area as well, The nature of the relationship is also important. Because of the importance of the parent-child relationship, because of the significance of that relationship, then what parents do matters. Sometimes I like to say that parents are like, when they interact, they're like talking through a megaphone. What they do actually matters for their child's social and emotional development because of the importance the child puts on that relationship. And so in every everyday interaction, there's two things going on. There's potentially learning and development going on, but there's also relationship building. There's also warmth and gentleness. There's also contingency. There's also sensitivity, and that's going to strengthening and shaping the relationship. We're also finding out more about the direct impacts of parenting through animal studies, which continue to show some amazing science going on there. For example, here's some research that was done with looking at rats, and what this research found was that the licking and grooming behaviour of mothers in the first 10 years of life significantly altered their baby's biological responses to acute stress. So the more that the baby was licked and groomed by the mother, the more equipped the baby was to handle distress or stress in their life. And not only did it equip them better in the here and now, it seemed to be kind of priming their stress response system. So here's an example where there's a direct biological level impact of parenting, where the style and nature of parenting is impacting on the child at a very fundamental biological level. And this kind of research is also now being replicated with human beings. And it's an exciting area of research, and again reinforces the importance of parenting behaviour. You might have heard about the EPI Study. This is some research recently released by Malouche and his colleagues. And if you just have a quick look at this graph, it looks at literacy and numeracy at age 11. And this longitudinal research has put these researchers in a position where they can say something about the impact of the home learning environment on, and also other factors on children's learning and development. And as you can see for literacy, the home learning environment there completely is so important and so powerful and completely dwarfs educational experience. You also see mother's education being really powerful there, and I think mother's education is a proxy for interaction and for the kinds of caregiving that are given to children. But as you can see here, that compared to almost everything else, the quality of the home learning environment, the quality of interactions going on between parents and children is a major, major contributor to the development of language and learning. There's been some other fascinating research too. I just wanted to share this piece with you. This piece of research looked at parent-child interaction, and it looked at it very much at a physiological level, at a brain level. And what they did was they conducted a study, an EEG study of mother-toddler brain activity during interaction. And just quickly, what you need to understand is that the symmetry of brain activity can reflect the emotional experience. So when the right side of the brain is really firing, when there's more left brain and less right, we have less negative emotion and we have less avoidance. When we have more right and less left, we have more negative emotion. And so what they did was they looked at the EEG of parents and children during interactions, and here's what they found. They found that when children misbehaved, then their parents' brain became all asymmetrical. And that was fairly fully consistent with sort of negative emotions. And then it also happened in reverse. When parents acted in a way that was even slightly hostile, then their own children's brains began to also go asymmetrical as well in a way that was consistent with negative emotion. And so here we have an example of where parent-child interaction is actually measurable and observable in its effects in a person's brain. And by the way, if you're a parent and you've ever said to a child, "You're messing with my mind," well, now you have the science to prove it. It may well have actually happened. They may well have been messing with your brain, producing some asymmetry in your brain behavior. As research develops, we're also learning about the impacts of parenting on different aspects of social and emotional experience. And this was a fascinating study that was done in relation to children's expression of shame and guilt. What they did was they looked at children at age 3 and again at age 6, and they looked at the expression of shame and guilt. Of course, shame and guilt does have a functional and developmentally appropriate role, but it can also become overactive, become a problem when it is overreactive, when children are feeling, exaggerated degrees of shame and guilt. That can be a problem. And this is what they found in their study. They found that fathers' depression and permissiveness was associated with higher expressions of children's shame and guilt. Interestingly enough, not mothers. So when fathers were more permissive and when they were depressed, we had higher childhood shame and guilt at age 6. So there was a direct relationship. There was also, by the way, a relationship between relationship conflict and shame and guilt. And so the researchers were quite interesting here. They don't really know why there's a relationship. At this stage, we can only say there's a relationship. But what they did have some interesting theories about it. For example, one of their theories was that it might be that children who don't get a experience with being corrected for behaving in a way that's not appropriate, and they don't get experience of getting feedback about their negative behaviour, don't get the opportunity to practice getting feedback and then integrating that into a healthy sense of their self. Because they're not getting a lot of feedback, they're not getting a lot of practice in integrating that into a healthy sense of self. When they finally do get the feedback, they overreact and they have actually more guilt and more shame than maybe what was needed or called for in terms of the situation. The other thing about this kind of research, though, that I find quite interesting is that I think we're starting to learn more and more about the differentiating impacts of fathering and mothering, and a lot of this will be kind of socially determined. I think it will change as fathers and mothers' roles develop and change, but I think at this stage there are some differences in the impacts of fathering and the impacts of mothering. Should be sensitive to that. By the way, they're relatively small differences. I just want to emphasise, though, they're relatively small, but they are interesting, and they could well be important clinically in the future. All right, the other thing before I move on from direct effects is I just wanted to emphasise this very important concept of differential susceptibility. I think this is a really important concept for us to understand. I think the driving scientific force behind this is Jay Belsky. What researchers have found is that children are different in their susceptibility to their environments. That means that they're different to the extent to which they are affected by their environment. And in fact, I think it was Deborah Phillips who coined the term dandelions and orchids. And what she was describing were children who, by virtue of their temperament and genetic inheritance, are not as sensitive to the environment. They kind of do okay, short of significant neglect and abuse. They kind of do okay in almost any environment. The orchids, on the other hand, are much more attuned to their environment, much more sensitive to the environment. And I think when I talk about this to parents, they can often identify their dandelions and their orchids. Those fairly low maintenance kids who are going to be okay, that's fine, and then the more high maintenance child who's much more sensitive to change. Now, one of the implications here is that there are some children who are going to be more sensitive to toxic environments. Okay, they're going to be more at risk when their environment is not optimal. But there's another really interesting implication here, and that is that they may differ in terms of their response to intervention. If you're more responsive and susceptible to your environment, then potentially you're going to be more responsive to positive changes in your environment. Sure enough, there is some research now that reinforces or suggests that this hypothesis is actually or potentially has some truth in it. What these researchers did, Shanger and colleagues, was they looked at a very strong evidence-based program. In fact, it's the Incredible Years. I know that there are a number of people in WA who use that program, the Incredible Years. And what they did was they identified children, well, they were all children who had behavioural problems, and what they did was they identified with each of the participants, they looked for biological markers of plasticity. That is, and they were dopamine markers. It beats me a little here. I'm not an expert on the biology of this, but what it is a biological marker of plasticity, which is an indicator of, in a sense, how sensitive you are to your environment, how changeable your behaviour is. And this is what they found. They found that the children who had higher plasticity responded more positively to the parenting intervention. And it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It means that if you've got a child with high plasticity and their parent changes the way they parent, then they're going to be more sensitive to that change and more responsive to that change. On the other hand, the dandelion, who is not as sensitive to the environment, may not respond as quickly or as positively to changes in that environment. And I think this is going to be very interesting for us going forward. I mean, I like to joke someday that, you know, maybe one day we'll ask kids to, you know, spit in a petri dish or onto a, I don't know, onto a tester, and that'll tell us exactly how much support this parent's going to need. Oh, buddy, you know, your mum's going to need a heap of support because you're not going to be very responsive to the changes that he or she makes. I don't know. Do you think we'll ever get there? Maybe, hopefully not. But it does suggest that we're going to need to have more flexible responses. You know, the one-stop shop, the one program with the one dosage may not suit. There may be some families who are going to need more than others because of their children's differential susceptibility to change. All right, so here I am banging away. Hope it's making sense. Again, if anything is not making sense, please ask questions or make any comments, and we'll try and respond. I've been talking about some of the direct effects of parenting. Now I want to talk about some of the more indirect effects of parenting. The first I want to talk about is mediating effects. And mediated effects are where the parenting is not the actual cause, but in fact is is actually an important part of the chain. Get my slide working. In fact, sometimes you can think about causation like a chain. So there's a context or a predictor variable, and there's a particular child outcome at the other end. When parenting is involved at a mediating level, what we're saying is that parenting is the link in the chain. That is, a particular context variable, the particular predictor, will not influence the child outcome unless it influences parenting. One really significant example of this is adversity, social adversity. So, for example, we know that poverty impacts on families and poverty impacts on children. But the way it does that is it impacts on the nature and quality that parenting receive, the parenting that children receive. And where parents can maintain sensitive, high-quality parenting, even in the context of poverty, they can protect their children from the negative impacts of poverty. And this is why, for example, there's great interest at a government level in parenting support in the early years, because if we can help parents who are in poverty create optimal home learning environments and strong parent-child relationships, we can have a protective or buffering impact on poverty. And recently there was a whole edition of the Lancet journal that was dedicated to arguing for parenting support, particularly in developing countries. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't do something about poverty. Of course we should, because that relieves pressure everywhere. But this is not an all or nothing scenario. And whilst poverty takes often generations to address, this is something we can begin to do immediately, is begin to support more effectively parents who live in low socioeconomic circumstances. Another very important example of the mediated impact of parenting is in relation to family breakup. And so divorce and separation is traumatic, of course, for all families and all children. But not all children whose parents divorce will have negative developmental outcomes. And this is because the key ingredient is the quality and nature of the parent-child relationship and the quality of parenting. So when a couple can preserve effective parenting, even though they're navigating a difficult breakdown in their own relationship, then they can preserve their relationship with their children and create a solid environment for their children. They can buffer the impacts, they can prevent the impacts of family breakdown on their children. So family breakdown is fully mediated by the quality and nature of parenting. Another very interesting piece of research that recently attracted my attention was research around self-compassion. And it turns out that self-compassion is an important mediator when it comes to parents who have had their own poor or negative experiences of attachment in early life. What this study showed was that if parents had poor attachment, and this was self-report, so it has limitations, if they were able to demonstrate a degree of self-compassion, that is, if they were able to give themselves room to make mistakes, if they were able to forgive themselves for making mistakes, if they were able to curb their self-criticism, then their own less than optimal attachment experience did not turn into poor quality of life outcomes for children. And also stress, where they had lower levels of stress, then their own experience did not translate into poor experiences for children. So it turns out this important aspect of psychological functioning, self-compassion, is an important mediator in between parents' own negative experiences in their childhood and also the results for their own children. And isn't it true that for many parents, self-compassion is so challenging, so challenging to be a little easy on yourself, to be a little forgiving on yourself. I think most parents could do with a decent dose of self-compassion. So here we are talking about mediating effects, and here's an example where adult functioning is an important mediating effect. All right, let's move on to moderated effects. Now, by moderating effects, what I mean is that parenting is not the actual cause, but what it does is it modifies the impact of the cause on the outcome. A way you could look at it is like this, that there's a relationship between a predictor, the cause if you like, and the outcome, but that relationship is fully moderated or influenced by parenting or the quality of parenting. And here's a good example of this. Now, we're all aware of how important attachment is, aren't we, to children's development and well-being. But it turns out that attachment may not be a cause in its own right for children's well-being and development. It may actually be a moderating impact or a moderating influence. So here's a study that looked at the role of attachment. So what we know is that there is a direct and well-established pathway between early negativity in infancy, that is difficult temperament, like a child who's overly emotional or is difficult to get into routines or is highly inhibited. There is a connection between those early challenges in temperament and later problems in adjustment right into the teenage years. There's a direct pathway between difficult temperament in infancy and problems later in life. What this research showed was that pathway is moderated by the strength of attachment. So when parents are able to maintain and demonstrate strong, warm, loving relationships with their children, even in the context of challenging temperament, then they can protect or change that pathway. And I think that's really important research. So what is the outcome of this? What is the outcome? The slide's affected. What is the outcome or the outtake of this? Well, here's the outtake. We need to be paying attention to parenting because parenting has direct impacts on children's development and well-being. But we also need to be paying attention to parenting because parenting can buffer the impacts of other circumstances, other external events. Parenting can be an important protector for children. And the third thing is that parenting can operate as a moderating variable. That is, it can change the pathway for children. And for each of those reasons, it becomes important to be advocating and supporting parenting. All right, let's move on now to talk a little bit about, given that, how do we think about parenting support? I don't know whether you've noticed this. Everybody seems to know how to raise children except the people who have them. I'm sure there's many parents who feel like that. But look, it is really true to say that parents are made, then they're not born. Parents are on a learning journey. They develop, and they develop mainly on the job. And we can think of parenting as a set of skills that can be acquired and enhanced through experience. We're not suggesting here that parents need a formal training, but that parents and human parents are not well equipped by their instincts to parent. They come into parenting feeling very new. They come into parenting equipped with adult capacities to learn and adapt. And then, all things being equal, they get the opportunity to learn and adapt on the job as they go. What we need to do is be thinking about, well, how do we support that process? We think it's useful to distinguish between parenting support, which is about influencing parent-child interaction, and parent support, which is about supporting the adult well-being of parents. Both of these are important, but they have slightly different underlying logics. And here the logic is represented here on this slide. If you look down the left-hand side, you see essentially the parenting support logic. The idea is with parenting support that we're trying to influence the nature of parent-child interaction because that is the thing that will ultimately influence and change the child outcome. If we can change the way a parent and child relate and interact, then we can change the child's experience. If we change the child's experience, we can improve their outcome. With parent support, on the other hand, the focus is on parental well-being and functioning. So when we're looking to do that, we're trying to help the adult become more healthy and stronger, because a healthier and stronger adult is going to be more likely to be able to engage in effective parent-child interaction, and therefore more likely to be able to produce the outcomes that they seek. Now, both of these are important, but they're different, and distinguishing the two things can often help you understand the underlying logic behind different supports. It can also help us untangle some of the fairly unproductive debates that go on around the place about the different types of parenting support, because sometimes we get confused the actual underlying logic. Most peer support programs, for example, fit on the right-hand side of this diagram, where the idea is about supporting parents as adults. Most parenting programs, like the Triple Ps or the Incredible Years or other programs like that, they fit on the left-hand side, where they're deliberately trying to directly influence parent-child interaction. And then many programs will actually have a mix of those things. They'll have a mix of both parent support and parent support. I do have an example that I prepared for you earlier. There are two programs our organisation's been developed, and they have these different program logics. The first is Small Talk, which is a program that's delivered through supported playgroups. The idea is that program is delivered, or that set of practices is delivered to disadvantaged families. The idea is that a simple coaching process will increase the frequency of daily quality interactions, which will improve children's language and cognitive outcomes. So the emphasis really here is very much on parent-child interaction, although given supported playgroups are also about parent support, but this particular aspect is very much about parent support. Another program that we developed was one we developed with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. This was for parents of children who have life-threatening illness and injury, and the idea of the program was to enhance parents' coping skills. So we developed an intervention based on acceptance commitment therapy, which was designed to improve coping skills, which was designed to protect parental mental health, the idea being that a stronger parent is going to be able to more effectively care for their seriously ill child. That will ultimately contribute to better outcomes for their children, but also certainly ensure that perhaps their parent doesn't go on and experience a more significant mental illness. So here's an example of distinct but also important ways of support. But also important ways of supporting parents, parent support and parent support. Okay, I do want to provide some chance. I know I've just been talking non-stop here, questions, and you might not even have time to type something in. So if you do have some questions, then please feel free to type them in and we'll come to them. I thought I would just touch on just a couple of what I think of as important developments in the area of parenting support coming up that we should or could be aware of. The first thing I just wanted to say is that I think we're going to be moving away from the traditional focus on parenting programs. And when you think about parenting support, often our mind goes to the delivery of programs. And I think we're going to see over time a change and a movement away from thinking about parenting support as only delivered through programs. And one example where we can see this change is the online delivery of parenting support. And I'm hoping that you're all familiar with the Raising Children Network, Australia's national parenting information website that's brought to you by the Parenting Research Centre and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. This is now a website that's been working for about 10 years, and it's been getting huge reach in the community. In fact, we need to update this data because I've just been informed today that we get 55,000 visits per day to the Raising Children Network. That is the number of people who actually visit the website looking for parenting support. And not only are they going to websites now, but parents are now going to apps. They're going to social media platforms. They're looking for support online, and they're looking for support that's accessible and available every day to them. And this is creating some very interesting possibilities for the delivery of parenting support. For example, in mental health, we've seen the delivery of more intensive mental health programs. We're seeing those being delivered online, often self-directed with very minimal support, and the research is showing that those online interventions can be, at least for many people, as effective as clinically delivered ones. And so this is very exciting because we can completely expand the reach and penetration of good evidence-based programs if we can make them available to people online. This is an example of a program we developed a few years ago, which is an interactive, father-friendly, by the way, program that's designed to help parents prevent crying and sleeping problems in children, prevent those problems developing. And it does that by going beyond just tips and information. It goes into a more interactive style of learning process, and we think that this is indicative of the future. Another thing we think is important is another example of the use of technology is technology like SMS or messaging. And you might be aware of Richard Fletcher's work from the University of Newcastle. He and colleagues have been developing a program called SMS for Dads, and this is now, I think, occurring in a number of states where dads get to register to this program, and they get regular SMS updates which have information about fatherhood and adjustment to fatherhood. Really interestingly, it also has this little capacity where the father can message back and indicate how they're feeling on a mood indicator. And if they indicate they're feeling highly distressed, they're going to get a message and then potentially a call back, and in this case it's from Panda, from a fully trained and qualified telephone counsellor who will come in or contact them via the telephone to have an initial conversation with them. And so here we have this sort of interactive use of technology. I mean, I wish this webinar could go on for 3 hours because there really are lots of developments that we could think about and talk about. But look, just at least one more that I wanted just to highlight before starting to wrap this up is the importance of the couple relationship. And I think what we're going to see more and more is the integration of parenting support work and couple support work. Already we have a wonderful program here in Victoria called the What Were We Thinking program, which, by the way, is the best named parenting program I think I've ever heard, What Were We Thinking? But that already has a very strong couples angle built into it, where the couple of very young infants are being asked to think about their relationship as well as think about how they're approaching parenting and how they're dividing tasks and so on. And we're quite excited about this because we do know from the research that the impact of the couple relationship is very significant on children's development and well-being. In fact, there is research that shows that pre-child couple conflict resolution style predicts children's outcomes. So even before you've had a baby, the way you get on with your partner, the way you resolve conflict is a predictor of your child's social and emotional development. How significant is that? You know, the couple relationship creates this emotional sort of infrastructure, if you like, this emotional climate in which children develop, and where there is a couple, that is important. And I think what we're going to see is more focus on these couple aspects, fathering and mothering together, and couple aspects in parenting support. I think that would be a very good thing. All right, maybe I could just, Anna, I'm seeing your messages there, looking for some more evidence and some referencing too. So the other thing I'll do is I'll make sure that the guys can circulate our reference list, if you like, and also we can make these slides available, which is going to be part of this process, so you can follow up those references. And good on you guys. Do not take a single word I am saying for granted. Read it for yourselves. Absolutely, so exciting and important. Okay. I haven't got a huge a bunch of questions yet to be looking at. So while you're still thinking, maybe I could just maybe sum this up a little bit. If we think about the future of parenting support, I think that what we're going to do is move more from programs, and we're going to start to think more about practice. We're going to start to think about integrating parenting support into everything that we do. And here's a slide, which is relatively complex, I apologise, but it is a way of representing where the possibility is, where the potential is for integrating parenting support into what we do. And so if you think about parenting support from the point of view of both primary, secondary and tertiary level types of intervention, parenting support has a role to play in all of these. So at the primary level of prevention, if that's what you're thinking, or health promotion, then there's certainly a role for accessible information, 24/7, being able to get it when you need it. Then there's a role for peer support, like opportunities to meet other parents and learn from each other. Then there's the potential opportunistic parenting support, like for example when you interact with your early childhood education provider and there's this opportunity because you've complained about something or raised an issue for your worker to be able to give you a pointer or some ideas or some tips or some suggestions about the way you might move forward. And then some states are better situated to do this and others, there's a universal parenting support, the kind of support provided through, for example, maternal and child health nursing services. And we think there is tremendous potential to start to think about how can we enhance the parenting support available through all of these different levels. How do we, for example, build on peer support platforms like playgroups? How do we make them more effective by integrating information more effectively into them or by connecting them better to more opportunistic sources of parenting support? How do we link these different levels up? And then secondary parenting support, well, that's important too, because we need to be able to identify those families who are going to need more help. And sometimes they will need help that's of a parenting support variety. Sometimes they're going to need help more from a parent support angle. So families dealing with children with more complex developmental issues, they need parenting support. They need support with bolstering their parenting skills so they can handle some of the additional challenges that they have to deal with in terms of promoting their child's development and learning. It's also parents though that come, to us and need more broad support. The kinds of parents that come to the attention of child welfare, sometimes they need support with their basic functioning. They need help to strengthen themselves as well as parenting support. And so they need a response that has a bigger parent support component, one that enhances their self-regulation, one that supports their functioning so they're better placed to be able to meet the challenges of parenting. And then I really promise now to stop. I think there's obviously a role for intensive parenting support delivered by family services at the tertiary level, where good, solid, evidence-based parenting support is being delivered to families who need more intensive support. And wouldn't it be wonderful if our adult-focused services were also contributing to this effort? Wouldn't it be fantastic if adult mental health, adult health services were conscious of their clients who are parents and were responding to adults as parents and who are thinking about parenting as a domain of life that has real potential leverage capability and real potential for improving adult functioning if only we could help adults in their own parenting and support them in the parenting role. So all in all, wouldn't it be terrific if everybody saw parenting support as core business? Okay. We have just a couple of minutes and I reckon I have got maybe one or two things. Do you see the couple focus also be covered by the online programs? I think that is a very good suggestion, Anna, because one of the most difficult things is getting couples into any kind of program. Very hard to engage couples at a preventative level, isn't it? And I think there is tremendous potential in engaging parents in online interventions. For example, the one that I mentioned earlier for parents of children with chronic illnesses and life-threatening diseases, we ended up with 100% father attendance with that. This was an iPad-based intervention which enabled couples to participate in the group program from their own homes. And we got really good participation. So I think there is really strong potential there. Okay. Do you see any conflict with doing more online and techno conference, doing more parenting support? That is a great question, given that we are the purveyors of the biggest parenting website maybe in the world. Absolutely. I don't want to create moral outrage or panic. I mean, there is huge benefits that are being delivered by online support and by online information. I mean, just think about it. Like parents now can, they can get access to the most amazing information that our own parents would have to possibly wait months for or never hear. So no, the good definitely outweighs the bad. But because this is such early technology, we are learning about its impacts. And like with everything, there will be downsides and there will be upsides. And what we have to do is mitigate the downsides and maximise the upsides. But that is a fantastic question. What do you think about ways of evaluating parenting support at different levels? Hey, I don't have a lot of time to go into that now, but could I encourage you to come back to our next webinar? Because in our next webinar, we're going to talk about evidence-based approaches to parenting support, and we're going to directly address that question about evaluation. So I'm going to get you to come back there. Now you're coming up with all your questions, and we're running out of time. I'm really sorry. I'm not going to be able to get to address all these. Could I just say about the circle of security? I know that circle of security has a lot of wide interest, and I know that practitioners involved in circle of security are very excited about its potential. The evidence for circle of security is still building, and I think it is building. In fact, there's been some recent research that has slightly strengthened the evidence. I think, though, at this stage, we should still be conscious that we are still learning and developing in that space, and that there's still much to learn about who, how, and why, or if ultimately that intervention is effective. So we should be keeping an open mind on that. Maybe one more question. Do you think we can do more to effectively build peer support? I reckon we could. I reckon we could do a lot more about doing that. And I think some of that has got to do with integrating those levels better. So how do people hear about peer support? Like, do they hear about it from their maternal and child health? Do they hear about it from online support? Do they get an opportunity? Is it cross-promotion? Do they hear about their different services? Because I think with a little cross-promotion, the more we can normalise participation in peer support, the better. All right, our time is up. I just wanted to, just before we stop, I just wanted to let you know that we do have some upcoming things. We have another webinar coming up about evidence-based parenting support, which is on the 3rd of May. I'm back in Perth in July delivering masterclasses on working with parents in early childhood and also on adult behaviour change. Maybe we could pick up some of the peer support there in that first one. And there will be versions of those in webinars as well. So if you can't make it to the masterclass, then there will be at least a shorter version here as well. So can I just do two things, remind you, there will be a copy of this available online if you want to share it with others or you want to revisit any of the material. If you can bear listening to me bang on again, you're more than welcome. Also, a copy of the slides we'll make available, and I will put together a reference list as well, so that you can follow up any of those references as well. So I think all that remains now, given that our time is done, is to thank you very, very much for your time, and we hope to see you next time.